Welcome to Good News, Bad News, the Libertarian Christian Roundtable, where every other week we challenge the status quo and give you the libertarian Christian analysis of what's happening in your world.
Welcome to another episode of Good News, Bad News, the Libertarian Christian Roundtable. With us today, we have three of our regular four, and we are joined also by our special guest, Jason Rink, who is on the board of the Libertarian Christian Institute with us, as well as being an active film producer and a whole lot of other crazy crap that I don't have time to explain. But Jason is here to talk a little bit about the LP with us later on today. But first, probably the hottest button news of the day and of the week and probably of the month is the trial of none other than Mr. Rittenhouse. The young man who at 17 years old was it Kenosha, Wisconsin. And am I getting that right?
Kenosha.
Kenosha, yeah. And ended up, in the midst of riots and a whole lot of violence took place and ended up, taking two lives and injuring another person. But what's going on here? So let's just throw this out there because there's so much to talk about here. Carrie, kind of bring us up to speed on what's been happening this week.
Yeah, you have the mainstream media story and then you have facts. So the mainstream media has been, telling us for a very long time that Kyle Rittenhouse is a white supremacist, is a murderer, is, might have otherwise been a school shooter. They've really blown this thing up. So just to refresh everybody's memory, this is, like you said, Norm, a 17-year-old boy. He's 18 now. 17-year-old boy found himself in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I guess he lives on the border there or something like that. Yep. But his mom took him to Kenosha. His plan was to provide first aid services to people and, keep himself safe. And he happened to be carrying around an AR-15, which he was trained on. And so at any rate, these were very violent riots, that were going on around him. And, the news stories that came out were very unclear, but since we've had the testimony in the case, what we're finding out is that, Kyle was really acting in self-defense, at least insofar as what we can tell from the testimony. Now, what's interesting about this story, though, is a couple of things. Number one is the prosecution's case has been very supportive and favorable of Rittenhouse, which is funny because, you would think that they would be trying to charge him with murder, not giving him all of the fuel to defend him, and that's certainly what they're doing. But the other piece is that the prosecutor, and I forget his name, but the prosecutor and the judge really got into it over some of the tactics that the prosecutor was using. One of which was he wanted the jury to render a judgment about his post-arrest silence. So basically, he wanted the jury to judge him based on his right to remain silent.
Which is total madness.
Which is, yes.
Come on.
If you heard what the judge said, like he's yelling at this prosecutor. So really, the story has more to do with the prosecutor and the judge and the fact that the prosecution side is making it clear as day that Rittenhouse acted in self-defense. I mean, Rittenhouse even testified himself, which is a strange tactic to do.
Unusual in a murder case. Yeah.
Yes, very unusual for the accused to testify, but he testified. And I saw some legal analysis from a Canadian lawyer that I've been following. I think his YouTube name is Viva Fry. But he was just saying that Rittenhouse's testimony was like spot on. It was the best that it could have been in that situation. And that's not even the story. The story is that the judge was screaming at the prosecutor for doing things that he knows he's not supposed to do. So that's the short story, I guess you could say.
One question I have just about, Rittenhouse testifying on behalf of himself is that, again, that is very unusual. So you have to ask kind of, well, why did his defense attorney either kind of permit him to do it per se, or encourage him to do it? And it had to be because of this very thing, right? That he actually can kind of acquit himself very well in front of the court, in front of the jury. And just goes to show like that's where this is at. I mean, the media spin on this has been absolutely heinous. And I mean, is it possible that he really isn't wrong? Yes, it is. We can't completely negate that possibility, but it doesn't seem to be the case based on the evidence that we've seen thus far. And of course, there's more to go, of course, but it is unbelievable to see just the way in which, I mean, this is almost a red pill, blue pill type of situation here. Just look at the way this is being spun, and you can't possibly conclude that there is anything but bias from the highest ups in the media in this respect.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting watching this whole thing unfold. I didn't pay close attention to the news stories that came out because they were just so inflammatory and just
bonkers.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely
the way they're
off the wall.
Talking about him is just seriously.
Yeah. So, Rittenhouse, I mean, he carries himself very well. And he knows enough. Part of his testimony was to point out that after he shot these two men in what he claims to be self-defense, and seems to be that way, he went to the police to turn himself in. If he was a murderer, I think that's even probably one of the reasons why the defense wanted him to testify, was because if he's a murderer, why would he turn himself in? So at any rate,
he's just that smart and devious.
Yeah.
Come on. Right.
Something that. Oh, go ahead. Well,
no,
I was going to say something on the whole media side of things, and I know that Twitter's not real life, but
thank you, Chappelle.
Oh, wow. Wait a second. That was a great quote. Twitter is not real life.
There were two posts I saw today that I thought were really interesting. One was somebody who was definitely a progressive, and she said, "I'm highly educated and reasonably perceptive, and it was only today that I learned that Kyle Rittenhouse's victims were white." Yeah. So it was like, and there was people in the chain who were like, wait a minute. I didn't. And so because of the context of how this happened and because of the coverage that surrounded it, there's a good number of people who didn't realize that the people he shot weren't like people of color. Right. People had this crazy perception. And then I saw this other post by this guy, Bill Ackman, who's a Democrat hedge fund manager, kind of a regular guy, but he supports Democrats. And he posted on his Twitter about how him and his wife, I think, watched the trial, and he was like, this Rittenhouse guy seems like he's innocent. And then he posted a whole chain about it, and then at the end he said, "Just got a call from the media asking if my Twitter account was hacked. That is, the reporter could not conceive of the idea that I could believe Kyle is innocent because I am not a right winger. Crazy." So I think this is the place where this is the context of this case in a lot of ways, because of when it originated in the BLM riots, all of the passion and all of the momentum around that. And now it's happening now. It's just it's interesting. There's a lot's changed, a lot's gone on since these happened. And so I do think you have people though who are watching it and taking it in, but at the same time, you definitely have people with their minds made up on either side of the aisle that it's not going to matter. Some people just want him to fry because it's like, why is he walking around with a scary gun? So.
I saw a tweet from some blue check person. I don't know who she was, but she said something like, so one of the people that Kyle shot had just been, if I'm recalling this correctly, had just been let out was it jail or the hospital? Anyways, he was supposed to be a known child pedophile predator.
Yeah.
And so she makes this tweet. Oh, well, if you're going to shoot, one child predator, why don't you shoot all child predators? And was like,
wait a second, wait, what?
I mean, it's interesting to see how many the left, who really, really, really wants their narrative to follow through, are now having to bend over backwards in order to
serve it. Yeah.
To serve it. And I want to say, one of the things that has been pointed out several times now is that even Joe Biden himself was calling Kyle a white supremacist. They were calling him a domestic terrorist. They were calling him all of these things. And
Don't forget that.
Yeah, right? And this is probably one of the more meta issues that we need to be paying attention to, is the politicians coming out and kicking up a ruckus without our actual judicial process taking place and being able to sort out the facts. And that is dangerous, absolutely dangerous.
I just want to say this, that point about Biden. Look, I am against all presidents, including the next one. However, the smartest campaign ad that a presidential candidate could probably put out about this would be to just paste that tweet up, and then have another clip once this all goes down, and because I do think that Rittenhouse will probably be acquitted, but then then video clip after that of Rittenhouse acquitted or something like that, and then just fade to black. I hope he's acquitted. Sponsored by thus and such.
I hope he's acquitted, because one of the other stories that are coming out are that there are people who want to or have started to try to intimidate the jury. Yeah. So that's not good. So I hope and pray that the jury makes the right decision. It seems obvious that Rittenhouse is innocent. He acted in self-defense. We're not judging whether or not it was wise for him to go in the first place. That's a completely different story. And certainly one that the prosecution is trying to spin. But the fact is he had the right of self-defense. It seems that he acted that way, and I hope the jury makes the right decision.
Yep. All right. Well, that seems like a pretty good way to wrap up that segment. But there is another topic though that is definitely at the forefront of everybody's mind right now, and that's the one thing that is hitting your pocketbook over the next year, and that is inflation.
It hurts.
Who knew that if you started injecting a lot of money into an economy that you might see inflation down the line? But our local economics researcher and expert in all such things, Mr. Liquidity himself, Aaron Sepulveda. Yeah. That's a new one. You're gonna actually, we should call you Dr. Liquidity down the line once that's solidified. You're gonna be Dr. Liquidity.
Dr.
It's like
Liquidity.
that'll be your supervillain name maybe instead. I don't know. Whatever. But Aaron, tell us what has been going on in the world of inflation here, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions. Certainly the Federal Reserve doesn't seem to know what it is. So why don't you explain to us what's going on?
Too much spending relative to the capacity to produce, which is the simplest you can get. Like, we can easily come back and go spend money because there's money available, and there's no conceivable way that we can come back to produce like before the pandemic. This is as straightforward as it is. If you guys want me, I'll try to show you guys some graphs, how quickly spending just came back up, and production can come back up. I mean, you can talk about all the political issues behind it, fuel restrictions on oil production, but this was completely predictable that if we can easily just go back and spend, but we cannot just go back and produce as before, because politics, pandemics, everything, lockdowns, everything you can imagine. So this was perfectly predictable. So that's what we're gonna have behind it, and literally the liquidity is available to get all the spending rise very quickly, but that doesn't equate to increasing productive capacity at anywhere near the same rate.
Okay, so if I understood you right, what you're saying is that so we saw productivity go down as a result of the pandemic. People are not working. There's a lot of stuff getting shut down in the totally unjust manner of the lockdowns and so on.
We need more space than before.
Okay. Yeah, and so as things are ramping back up, there was this intent that, oh well, if we just inject more money into the economy, a very Keynesian idea, of course, well then we can stimulate demand, and then that will bring people back into production. Is that how they're thinking? That's the theory.
Usually when it comes to like, forget about theory, just like what actually happens in the real world is just everybody wants the Fed to expand the balance sheet so that there's enough liquidity to make payments, whatever debts are outstanding, so they get paid. That's it. Okay, but when you do pay debts, which I guess that will be good, that's gonna leak into the real economy. And it's as simple as that. You can eat, honestly, it's not so hard, no matter how much physical distancing we're practicing and masks and lockdowns, whatever it's not hard to go spend and then come back home or just order stuff online. So spending can just beat up prices very quickly with no connection whatsoever with the production with the production structure. Yeah. And that was completely predictable that this was going to happen. So
why then is the Federal Reserve so confused?
I'm actually wondering that exactly what is it that they're. I know for sure that the specific statements are, we are going to be much more tolerant to inflation than ever. I guess 70s stuff, whatever. They openly said a yes, for sure. So that in itself beats up prices because the expectations of future inflation immediately rise. So just there, you already have one problem. At the productivity issue, we need more space, we need more time, we need more what we call real resources that don't happen to be money. So we don't have them because all of the politics, lockdowns, pandemics, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that they're surprised by the numbers. I totally doubt it. And I know that many economists, including if you guys get to Twitter, I think one of the best economists to follow will be Lawrence White, trying to make the case, guys, actually we already came back to original rate of spending than before very quickly.
Right.
We do have to start lowering the monetary expansion as soon as possible. They try to taper, which means, just in case you guys ever heard the word taper, is instead of creating, I'm gonna make up a number right now, $80 billion a month, they're gonna create $60 billion a month for a couple of months. And that's what taper means. Exactly. Not. It's not they're decreasing the money supply. What they're doing is they are just increasing the money supply at a lower rate. That's all. That's all that is happening. And most, I think that the big issue that the big debates all the way back from the Great Depression, and I guess late 800s, is outstanding debt. Everyone's concerned about that. If some of you guys know history about the Silverites, Brian, do you remember the Bryanites in the late 1800s? The big issue was always why they wanted silver instead of gold. It's because there's a bunch of outstanding debt that expansion in monetary policy makes it easier for debtors to make back those payments. And that's really what's behind all this. And inflation, it's really not going to change the minds of these sort of, let's say, pressure groups or that, okay, yeah, prices are going to get high. Well, yeah, but I can pay. And that's no different than Argentina. Everyone, it's happy to have expansionary policy because everyone's getting subsidies from whomever is in charge. So whatever inflation is, the government just literally just creates more to try to cover all their commitments, all their electoral commitments, which is kind of, if you wish, what is happening right now, which is just expansionary policy to cover electoral commitments that were done, a year ago or so.
Well, this is all, described in even greater detail in, Austrian business cycle theory, where the people who benefit first from the expansion of the money supply are those who are carrying debts, namely people like the government and the banks and so on. I mean, that is the whole point. Those who have the capacity to make the loans or to take out loans in order to do what they want and then create the money with which to pay it back. Well, but there is not an immediate effect upon the price levels. And see, I think this is the confusion that a lot of people seem to have about, there's inflation and then there's inflation. Okay. What I think that what most people think of in terms of inflation is really symptomatic of what is real inflation. And that's what we understand through Austrian econ and the correct theory of money supply, which is that real inflation is directly related to the amount of currency that is available. So the M0, M1, M2, if you recall those from your macroeconomics courses, those things swelling is what's real inflation. What happens symptomatically is the price levels change. And prices will change for a variety of different reasons, as we know. Increased demand of something means that, those tickets that you wanted to go see Pearl Jam or whatever are going to be more expensive, depending on the demand. Yeah.
Increased velocity of circulation.
Sure. But it's like, it's not immediately the case to say, well, okay, because there's an increase in the price, that means it's inflation. Well, it's an increase in the price level, but it's not necessarily inflation. Just because, anyway, that's sort of the point that I think that a lot of people seem to miss, and as well. And so to keep that in mind, and if you really want to, kind of beef up your knowledge in this, go read things like "What Has the Government Done to Our Money" by Murray Rothbard, or "A Theory of Money and Credit" by Ludwig von Mises.
Banking actually is pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the inflation story for you. Hopefully that makes some sense, and we'll provide some resources hopefully in the show notes so you can go learn more. But it really is incumbent on all of us to begin to understand better these types of economic vehicles and how things work.
And I just wanted to say one thing, a small business owner. And so I've been paying attention and tracking a lot of the liquidity that the government has been pumping into the business sector through COVID and the EIDL program. And what a lot of people are not aware of is that the EIDL program actually quadrupled the amount of money available to businesses. And this money is, it's really easy to qualify for. You're qualifying for up to 2 years worth of working capital, essentially at a 3.75 rate for 30 years payback. So it's essentially mortgage rates and mortgage payback on liquidity now. And 2/3 or 3/4 of that money hasn't even funded yet. The quadrupling of that money hasn't actually started to reach the businesses yet, started to reach. And I think it's like $150 billion. And again, we're talking trillions of dollars these days. Billions of dollars, what's that? No big deal. But it's just interesting how there's all of these different places around the structure of production and in the economy that there's this targeted liquidity being pushed into, and it's easier money that hasn't been available before. It's been very unusual for businesses to qualify for these kinds of dollars at these rates with these payback structures in the past. And so I think that's just one example of many, many different hidden vehicles of targeted liquidity injection into the economy that this started over a year ago, but some of this money has yet to even hit the beginning of the economy.
And I want to add, this is the big issue, and a lot of people would like to deny it, but it's straightforward. Usually when there's monetary expansion, it takes long for consumer prices to rise because, as you said, it gets targeted to different stages of production. They're way before consumption. That stimulus checks, which oddly enough, I think most Austrians would say, actually, those ones are nowhere near as bad as the target liquidity at early stages of production, because it lets you see the inflation right away. Why? Because as soon as families get extra income, are going to go spend it, and that immediately beats up prices, and you can immediately see, everybody can immediately see it. The one behind it, expansion through the financial markets and all that takes time. It starts changing the way that we produce stuff, and there's not enough time or resources to actually finish all those long-term projects that we never know if we're gonna have enough resources, in a couple of years, and then we have recessions because of that.
Yep.
So yeah, look out below, because that's the chickens are going to come home to roost sometime.
Buy Bitcoin.
And yeah, so yeah, buy Bitcoin. There you go, baby. And yeah, new all-time high. Woo! All right, but all right, but on from there. We wanted to address something else tonight that we thought was pretty interesting, and this is the main reason why we wanted to make sure that we got Jason Rink on our show today, and that has to do with some analysis that he did recently and presented, and we will make sure the link is available to you below on the Libertarian Party victories, or are they? that occurred in the latest election this cycle, just a week and a couple days ago. So Jason, kind of introduce how you got interested in this particular story and what you kind of uncovered through it, and then we'll talk about some of the lessons I think learned after that.
Yeah, what kind of got me down this road is I've been listening to a lot of conversation that's happening in friggin' libertarian nerd world that the regular world
which
is
we're
not
all
even
part of.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been this conversation that's been going on between sort of there's been this conversation of the old school LP, the like Mises Caucus LP, and then some other guys that are kind of in the post-libertarian Mises GOP side of things, where it's sort of a discussion of strategy. Like, what are we going to do when it comes back to taking electoral seats back, and how do we take the power back, so to speak, to move things back towards liberty? And
but can you define something real quick though, just for this potentially uninitiated, and to make sure that I even understand this better? When you say post-libertarian, what in the world are you talking about, man?
Well, so there's a group of people and numerous podcasters who have some audiences, right? And it's people I would classify people like Tho Bishop with the Mises Institute, and Pete Quinones with the Libertarian Institute, guy like Buck Johnson who's got a podcast, and a number of these guys who I like all these guys. I think they've all got some interesting ideas. And they're sort of pushing a conversation that I think is going to be squarely in the Hoppian side of libertarian thought. Okay. And even guys who are bringing up the like monarchist arguments, right? Like how, it's kind of the democracy, the God that failed sort of idea. And I apologize if I'm not actually explaining this appropriately to those that I'm bringing into this conversation. But the point is that there is an argument to be made, and it's an argument that I've been looking at for the last few years, which is that, number one, in order to actually secure liberty for ourselves, we may actually have to examine how we would take the levers of power back. Meaning, we can't surrender the levers of power and allow them to be utilized on us for a cause that is not liberty, which is what's happening right now. And so you can argue whether or not we should be politically involved in trying to take the levers of power back and what it means to get into office and all that stuff. That's a side note. But to the degree that you believe that we should be engaging in politics and trying to get libertarians or liberty-minded people elected to office, right, to make an impact, if you believe that, then the question is, what is the most effective vehicle to do that? And I would say, given what's transpired over the last couple of years, how quickly can we do it? Because I think we've seen an acceleration towards, big government tyranny and, the annihilation of liberty through many different things that have happened. And so that's a good backdrop then. So where does how does this LP analysis kind of fit into it then? Well, the analysis is because there's a bit of a debate that says, hey, we should try to use the LP, the Libertarian Party, as the vehicle in order to take these seats, right? In order to, use the ballot access, all that sort of thing. Yeah. And the Libertarian Party came out after the recent election last week, and their headline was Libertarian Party shatters records as unprecedented number of libertarians are elected to office. and this idea that there's some mass rejection of the two-party duopoly, and we're seeing that because of all these libertarian wins. And so what I just was saying was like, I was like, well, what are the real numbers here? Because I don't know. And look, I'm the guy who's followed libertarian politics, but I've never really looked at the results. What I see here feels a little bit like spin to me, frankly. And by the way, I don't think the incentives are there for people who really want to promote the LP as the ideal vehicle to actually take this data that I've looked at and show it and be like, hey, here's the real results, right? And so that's what I did. I dug into 100 races. There was over 150. I don't know how many there were, but I looked at 100 races, and I was looking at the races of people that won, by the way. So I was just looking at the list of winners. That's what they posted. And as I started breaking it down, what I found was that 84% or 84 out of 100 of these races in the states that had races, they were unopposed seats. Now, many people who've been around the Libertarian Party for a long time are familiar with the fact that they're like, yeah, we got to run for constable and everything. And I'm not saying that you don't need to. I'm not disagreeing with filling every seat at every level, and especially the local levels, with liberty-minded or libertarian people. That's great. But what I will take issue with is this idea that the LP is what people are even choosing. No. In fact, what I'm seeing is that if you have a name, only one name on the ballot, that person will win. And it doesn't matter what the letter is next to their name. And in fact, once you start seeing a competitor with an LP candidate for any seat at any level, even those low levels, the LP candidate almost always wins, or almost always loses to any other party candidate. And so what my contention is that the LP designation isn't necessarily helping anything, and in fact may potentially be hurting the chances of a candidate to get into office. And frankly, that it might be better off to take those exact same people and bring them in through the GOP, because they're more likely, as they get political experience, to rise to those higher levels where there is competition, because the higher elected seats have competitors because there's more power, there's more money, there's more influence, there's all of the reasons people go into office that we hate. It's more present there. And so the competition's stiffer. And so when you get stiffer competition, it's very rare for a libertarian to actually win the seat. And so when we get into the discussion of what's the optimal vehicle, what I'm saying is, if you're going to take over auditor and constable and mayor of a city of 1,500 people, like, it doesn't really matter what party you run in for some of these seats. And in fact, some areas of the country, you're going to be better off running a GOP strategy. And so like Buck Johnson is talking about running for mayor of Lockhart, Texas. He's a libertarian, but he's going to do that as a Republican candidate in order to win. And you know what's funny? He's a guy with a popular podcast, like in libertarian niches. He's got a good chance of putting a little bit of a coalition together to actually become a mayor of Lockhart, but probably not as the LP candidate. And so I just think that what I broke down in what was about a 45-minute video, I think should bring us to a discussion of saying, hey, are we interested in preserving the LP as the vehicle for bringing candidates who have liberty-minded ideas? Or let's just be honest, when we look at some of the most liberty-minded candidates that have had any success at any level, we're going to be talking about people like Ron Paul and Thomas Massey and guys who, frankly, and by the way, I'll even throw something in there too. There was another race that happened that wasn't a libertarian. This guy, Edward Durr, who was a Republican, and he's not a libertarian at all, but he was the truck driver who spent $200, right? Listen, that guy's not a libertarian, okay? But he managed to unseat like a Democrat, like the guy who was the state house head or whatever in New Jersey. And he did it with almost no budget, and being a guy who like just was running as a Republican, taking advantage of this shift that happened. I'm going to tell you right now, Ed Durr doesn't take that seat running as a Libertarian candidate. And so I'm saying, hey, like, what if we could cultivate our own candidates and said, we're going to navigate through the party system, which is designed to keep LP candidates out. I don't care how long we've had ballot access, and we can talk about whether or not the strategy for the LP is better for us to say, hey, listen, let's get a guy like, by the way, this is just a strategy, a theory, right? But like if the LP wants to run a guy like Dave Smith for president, he's a guy who can get onto the Tim Pool show and Joe Rogan and spread the liberty ideas. He's not going to become president. I think that's useful. Not saying it isn't, but this idea of moving through the system of lower levels offices through the LP to one day get the higher offices, I think is a bit of a myth. And by the way, I don't really think we have the time to wait for all of the constable candidates to spend the next 15 to 20 years getting to the point where they can maybe run and win a state house race.
Okay,
So,
Jason, can I
yeah,
interrupt?
no, I'm done. Yeah.
It's a little aside parenthesis, if it helps at all. The state where I grew up in Mexico, Nuevo León, the last two governors have not spent a dime on TV. Both last governors have been what you can consider social media personalities, influencers.
Yep.
And is the most prominent state in Mexico. Just to give you guys a point of reference.
I think that's a really important
that is in North Texas.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think we're in I would argue that Obama was actually the first celebrity president, really. He kind of had a celebrity cachet to him. Trump unquestionably was a celebrity president. I think we're in the era of
how was Ronald Reagan not a celebrity president?
He was. You're right. Thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah, no.
Sorry. Gotta stomp you there.
but the idea is that I think when you talk about that idea, it's like, hey, yeah, maybe we should be looking at how do we take and recruit these micro celebrities and influencers who have got powerful platforms and are going to adopt the LP position and possibly then utilize the LP to do that. Of course, I would argue that same person, based on their platform, could do it for any party and probably still have the same or better result. So, but I do think we need to think differently about what it means to try to approach political strategy. And I think there are people who are being inflexible about how this thing might go down. Like there may be numerous strategies at numerous levels in different geographies that are going to be necessary in order to see liberty-minded people prevail and try to put a tourniquet on, the bleeding that's been going on for many years and decades at this point.
Well,
that was my complaint.
I think it's no secret that libertarians can be their own worst enemies. And, you've got factions within the LP to begin with. And now you have these, as you can call them, post-libertarian Mises GOP guys, and I have a great deal of respect for Pete Quinones. And so, it seems to me that libertarianism and, Austrian economic theory is based on this idea that liberty is multifaceted, right? Mm-hmm. And our decisions, our strategies, all of these things are going to be multifaceted necessarily. So there isn't a single strategy that's going to work. We aren't central planners. We can't centrally plan liberty. We cannot centrally plan our way back, into political power or into political power at all. So, I kind of wish that libertarians would just sort of cool their heads a little bit. Because, hey, there's no single approach. We can't actually be libertarian and think that there is one way to do it.
I think that something that Jason brought up, and I just want to emphasize this particular point. If we're going to be and actually, let me preface this by saying that in as much as, you know, the Libertarian Christian Institute is concerned, right, we are not advocating for any particular candidate or even for voting itself when it comes down to it. But in as much as the LP's presentation of the data is concerned, I think, and this is, I don't know, maybe this is just me on my own soapbox, but I'm increasingly disgusted by the kind of verbal abuse, if you will, or misuse of words in order to describe what is happening. I think it's important to, you know, when we like, let me say this, actually, that this is a good way of putting it. When Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, he's saying more than just you need to stick true to your commitments or something like that. I think if you start looking into the theology there, that there's a sense in which the more important sense that is being spoken of there is that we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that it is important to manipulate others through our language to get what we want. And it's not about even just saying, you know, like, because you can use the truth, you can weaponize words any number of ways. And this to me is where the LP is making a mistake. In that if we're presenting it, yeah, sure, we had 150 victories or whatever. Okay, great. You know, but let's not confuse ourselves or delude ourselves into thinking wrongly about what the import of all of this is. Yeah. And I've long been an advocate of, you know, I love this phrase of this, something one of my buds at one of the founders of Students for Liberty said years ago. He's like, our strategy has always been let 1,000 flowers bloom. And that I thought was a great way of putting it. I don't know if he got it. He made that up himself. You know, Clark Rupert said that to me once, and I was like, you know what? I love it. That's exactly what it needs to be. But it doesn't do us any good to delude ourselves about what is actually happening.
Well, and I just want to say one thing. I would actually potentially get behind a message where they were like, hey guys, there's this one cool trick we can do. Yeah. And if we do it, we can actually take over 10,000 seats next year. Here's what's going to require. Right? And it's like, listen, they're all hyper local, small races, but nobody competes for them. But what if we freaking flooded it? And it's like, and somebody was like, and this is what it'll cost. And I'm like, oh yeah, fine. Great.
Yeah, that sounds great, right?
What, $1 million? Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. And then it's like, but it's like,
build your platform, you know?
Yeah, I'm down. But it's like, for it to be this sort of thing that I'm like, okay, you know,
self-congratulatory.
Yeah, it make it sound like the yellow waves happening. It's like, guys, that's not what's happening. And in fact, and this is more my point, is like, we've come out of a year and a half that if the time would be ripe for the message of liberty, you would think it would be now.
Yeah.
And it's like, the results aren't that people are really turning more to liberty. Like, I think we're seeing the pendulum swinging back hardcore to the red wing. And by the way, like, I think Trump 2024 could be the guy they warned you about, you know, that didn't exist, you know, 4 years ago.
That's
friggin' a thin-skinned egomaniac with nothing to freaking lose, you know? And so I just think there's not a yellow wave happening. Let's be clear about it. But what would be the most effective strategy? You get as many liberty-minded people in places of import and have a platform of impact, you know? And so, you know, that's the point. And I'm interested in figuring out how to create more liberty in our lifetime for me personally and the people I care about.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, Jason, I would thank you for bringing this up. And I think Norman made me kind of like see an angle I hadn't seen before. We tend to say we have to be careful with the dark arts of rhetoric, which can blind even yourself when you use rhetoric.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing it up. Now, my concern, and it's that this idea of criticizing openly LP strategy, either from the Mises Caucus or from the the other wing, whichever one it is. It was really like, if you're not doing my 3 things that I like, and you're doing those things with the LP, then you're just wasting your time.
Yep.
And my response was, I'm sorry. And then again, I'm going to repeat it every single day of my life. It's the division of labor and specialization says no. There's no conceivable way that you can know that this is a waste of time or not. I'm not saying that there's no objective truth or whatever, but there are a bunch of stuff that we cannot know. And that's why it goes both ways. Some guys are saying, and I even heard Kinsella talk about this, you know what, I think Kinsella, who has been an activist for years and years, said, you know what, I think actually what really matters is that we become wealthy and we literally buy our freedom or something like that. And that's another strategy, honestly. Like, and there's another one that say work locally with the Republican Party. I would say work locally no matter what. And another one say no, use the LP infrastructure. For me, honestly, all of them have to be used. I understand that for politics and for a lot of stuff that we can discuss later on when we have time, there's some type of centralization that is either yearned for. It has to do with time preference. So I understand why there's pulls towards centralization because of the time preference issue. But I would honestly just step and say, the focus has to be upon let as many different strategies go, and because there's no conceivable way that we can know ahead of time which is actually going to work or not.
And you got to look for those opportunities where you can make a difference. You know, I never thought that, you know, we would be in a position 10 years ago where it would be feasible to think that there was some sort of redeemable value out of the freaking Texas legislature. But then David Simpson came, and I don't know how, like, goodness gracious. I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better advocate for us. And I just about, well, he's not a candidate anymore, so I can say that now, right? Yeah, he's, you know, so the man is amazing. And I'm not going to go into that because we're out of time here, but, you know, look into history of you know, good old David. And I like, you have to accept the fact that, yeah, like what you're saying, Aaron, is so true. You're not going to be able to necessarily anticipate where the opportunity is going to be, but you sure as heck need to be ready to take advantage of it when it's there.
Yep.
So that's, I think, you know, perhaps a good way we can kind of end on that note, that there is no single path to to victory here. And you know, to be prayerfully watchful over all of this stuff, and just remember ultimately that, you know, when it comes down to it, you know, the best we can sometimes do is just improve ourselves constantly. And, you know, thereby, like, you always have the church, guys. That's your victory in right now.
Yeah.
So stick with the body of Christ, and you're going to be all right. Sounds like a good plan. I think it sounds like a good plan. All right. So that's been our episode tonight, fellas. Thanks, Jason, for joining us, and to my friends, Carrie and Aaron, as always. We are the Libertarian Christian Institute. Please like and subscribe our video, blah, 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 blah. This is what all the people do when they talk about their videos. Subscribe and check us out on our, we have another podcast, the Libertarian Christian Podcast. And this is even now being produced in audio only form now. And so subscribe to that as well. Please leave us a review, leave us a like, leave us a comment. We do read everything, and we will try to respond if you have a question as well. So talk to us via our website. Come to visit us at libertarianchristians.com, and we will see you